They laughed at her before she even opened her mouth. That was the thing Eliza Monroe could never quite get used to. Not the cruelty itself, but the speed of it. The way a man's eyes would travel from her face down the length of her and back up again, and in that single second, before she'd spoken a word or moved a muscle, the decision was already made. She wasn't worth the trouble. She wasn't worth the time. She wasn't even worth the basic courtesy of pretending. She'd walked into the Red Hollow Cattlemen's Exchange on a Tuesday morning in October, and the laughter started before the door swung shut behind her. "Lord Almighty," said the man behind the counter, a thick-necked rancher named Deacon Price, who wore his money the way some men wore a second skin, comfortable and permanent. He looked at her, then looked at the two men standing beside him, and grinned the kind of grin that didn't need a punchline because the joke was standing right there in the doorway. "What do we have here?" It wasn't a question. Eliza had heard that tone so many times she could have narrated what came next with her eyes closed. The glances exchanged, the smothered sounds, the deliberate slowing of whatever business had been happening before she walked in, because whatever this was going to be, it was worth stopping for. She kept her chin level. She'd learned that much. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Heard you manage contracts for the ranches in the county. I'm a hard worker, I know cattle, I know horses, and I don't need much to get started." Deacon Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it toward her. "Help wanted," he said. "Domestic work, cooking and washing, over at the Whitmore house. That's the kind of work you'd be suited for." "I'm not looking for domestic work." "Well?" He spread his hands wide, an exaggerated gesture of helplessness. "I don't know what to tell you, ma'am. The ranches around here need men who can work a 16-hour day in hard country. No offense meant." Every word of it was offense meant, and every person in that room knew it. "I can work a 16-hour day," Eliza said. "I'm sure you believe that." That was all. That was the whole conversation as far as Deacon Price was concerned. He turned back to the men beside him and picked up whatever he'd been saying before she walked in, and the three of them resumed their discussion as if she had already left. Eliza stood there for 3 more seconds. Not because she hadn't understood. She'd understood perfectly. She stood there because she refused to make it easy for him by disappearing the moment he turned his back. She made him ignore her deliberately, made the rudeness a conscious act rather than a casual one, and then she walked out. The door swung shut behind her. Outside, the October wind was cutting and cold, carrying the smell of dust and dried grass. The town of Red Hollow stretched out along a single main road. A general store, a livery stable, a small hotel with a sign that had weathered to illegibility, 2 saloons. It was not a place that invited strangers, and it made no effort to hide that fact. This was the 4th town in 8 months. Eliza stood beside her wagon, an aging rig she'd bought with the last of her savings in Missouri, which had made the journey west with considerably more complaint than confidence, and tried to think past the heaviness sitting in her chest. It wasn't heartbreak anymore. She'd moved past heartbreak somewhere back in Kansas. This was something older and harder. The feeling of a door that didn't just close but locked, and you heard the bolt slide home, and you stood on the wrong side of it trying to figure out how you kept ending up there. She wasn't stupid. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. She had known it since she was 7 years old and heard the other children in school whispering behind their slates, heard her own name used as a punchline in a joke she hadn't been meant to catch. Her size had been the first thing about her that the world decided to notice, and the first thing it decided to hold against her. In a world that made a religion out of smallness in women, small voices, small appetites, small footprints, Eliza Monroe took up space in a way that no one had asked for, and apparently no one was prepared to forgive. She'd tried to outrun it. That was what the journey west had been, if she was honest with herself. Not the romantic kind of westward flight, the kind in the dime novels her mother used to read, all wide skies and fresh beginnings. This was the desperate kind, the kind where you sold everything you owned in a town where you'd never been anything but the wrong kind of woman, and you pointed a wagon toward the horizon and told yourself that somewhere out there, what you could do would matter more than what you looked like. She was still waiting to find that place. She gathered the reins and turned the wagon north out of town, toward the cluster of ranches she'd spotted on the county map she'd bought in Tulsa. If the Cattlemen's Exchange wouldn't broker her, she'd go directly. She'd done it before. The first ranch she tried was a prosperous-looking operation called the Bar J, with whitewashed fences and a bunkhouse that looked newer than most of the buildings in town. She pulled up to the main gate and called out, and after a minute a young man came around from the side of the barn, maybe 19, with the careful look of someone who'd been told to handle whatever showed up at the gate. She stated her business. He looked at her the way people in this county apparently looked at people. A fast, comprehensive scan, a conclusion, and then a different kind of expression altogether. Not cruelty, this time. Pity, which was in some ways harder to take. "I'll check with the foreman," he said, and went off to do that and came back in 4 minutes to tell her the foreman said they weren't hiring. "Could I speak to the foreman directly?" Eliza asked. "He said to tell you he's not hiring." The second ranch turned her away at the gate without bothering to go check with anyone. The woman who answered, somewhere in her 50s, weather-hardened, with the kind of expression that suggested she'd already categorized the world into things worth her time and things that weren't, took one look and said they were full up and closed the gate. The third ranch was a different calculation entirely. The man who owned it was named Halverson, and he was one of those men who disguised contempt as generosity, which was, in Eliza's experience, the most exhausting kind. He invited her in, offered her coffee, asked her questions about her experience in a tone of polite interest, and then, when she'd finished answering, leaned back in his chair and said that he appreciated her honesty and her willingness to make the journey, but he had to be honest with her in return, and the honest truth was that the men on his crew wouldn't accept direction or cooperation from a woman in her situation, and he'd be doing her a disservice by pretending otherwise. "What situation?" Eliza asked, though she knew. He gestured vaguely. "Well, you know." She knew. She drove back toward town with the afternoon sun dropping behind the ridge and the wagon's right rear wheel making a sound. It hadn't been making that morning, a slow, grinding protest that she identified as a bearing beginning to go. One more thing. She added it to the list she'd been keeping in her head since Missouri. The list of things that needed fixing, replacing, managing, surviving, and thought about the coins in the tin box under the seat, and tried to do the arithmetic in a way that came out better than it had the last 3 times she'd done it. It didn't. She was passing the Callahan Ranch, a mid-sized operation set back from the road, not the largest in the county, but well kept in the way that spoke of sustained effort rather than inherited ease when she saw the horse. It was tied to the post outside the front gate, a bay gelding that should have been the picture of working ranch health, but wasn't. The animal was holding its left foreleg off the ground, not dramatically, not with the violent trembling of a fresh injury, but with the careful, deliberate stillness of something that had been hurting long enough to learn how to manage it. Its head was down. Its eyes had the dull, inward look of an animal that had stopped expecting relief. Eliza pulled up. She sat there for a moment watching the horse. Then she wrapped her reins around the brake handle, climbed down from the wagon, a maneuver she'd performed enough times in her life that she'd stopped thinking about how it looked to other people, and walked to the animal. The bay didn't flinch away from her. That told her something. It was too tired to startle, which meant it had been standing there long enough that even the arrival of a stranger didn't register as a threat. She ran her hand down the foreleg, slow and steady, and the horse shifted slightly, not away from her but almost toward her, the minimal lean of an animal hoping for something it had stopped believing in. She picked up the hoof. The stone was deep, a sharp, angular piece of flint that had worked itself up into the soft tissue of the frog and lodged there, the kind of thing that would have been merely uncomfortable at first and then, over hours, progressively worse, and if it had been left another day would have started to cause the kind of damage that didn't entirely heal. She could see where the tissue had already begun to respond, the slight swelling at the edges of where the stone contacted flesh. She didn't have proper hoof picks in her kit. She had a folding knife with a narrow blade, and she used the back edge of it, careful and patient, working the stone loose without pressing it further in, and the bay stood absolutely still for her the entire time, as if it understood on some level that stillness was the only cooperation it could offer. The stone came free. The horse put its hoof down, shifted its weight experimentally, and after a moment lifted its head to a normal angle for the first time in what Eliza guessed had been hours. "There you go," she said quietly. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice came from the direction of the gate. Eliza turned. The man standing there was somewhere in his late 30s, lean in the way of men who worked hard and had never had the time or inclination to stop. He had dark eyes and 3 days of stubble, and the particular expression of someone who had come around a corner to find a stranger handling something he valued, and whose immediate response to that was anger first and information later. Your horse had a stone in its hoof, Eliza said. Deep one. It had been there a while. The man, she didn't know yet that his name was Wyatt Callahan, that this was his ranch, that he'd left that horse tied for 2 hours while he dealt with a fence emergency in the east pasture, and had come back intending to deal with the horse's slight lameness before someone noticed and made an issue of it. Looked at her, then looked at the horse, which was now standing squarely on all 4 feet with its head up. You're on my property, he said. I stopped on the road. Your gate was open. The gate was open because I left it open. I know, Eliza said. I figured you'd be back. The horse needed help. The man stared at her. Not the stare she'd been getting all day. Not the assessing, dismissing, deciding stare. Something different. He was looking at his horse, then at her, then at his horse again, running some kind of calculation she couldn't entirely read. The stone's on the ground if you want to see it, she said. You'll want to keep an eye on that spot for a few days. There's some tissue response starting. It'll probably be fine, but if it doesn't clear up in a week, get a farrier to look at it. She walked back to her wagon. Hold on. She stopped but didn't turn around. Where are you coming from? He asked. Red Hollow. Before that, the Bar J, the Fenner Place, Halverson's. A pause. You were looking for work. I was. Past tense. You find any? She turned around then, because the question had an edge to it. She didn't understand yet. Not mockery, not the performative sympathy she'd gotten from Halverson. Something more careful. No, she said. Wyatt Callahan looked at her for a long moment. The sun was going down behind the ridge, and in the thinning light his expression was harder to read. He looked like a man arguing with himself, which was a thing she'd seen before, though it had never yet come to anything in her favor. I'm not hiring, he said. Something clenched in her chest. She turned back toward the wagon. I said I'm not hiring, he said again, and something in his voice made her pause. I'm giving you a chance to show me what you can do. That's different. She turned around. His face was not warm. She wasn't going to tell herself it was something it wasn't. It was guarded and uncertain and carrying the particular stiffness of a man who'd said something he wasn't entirely sure of and was waiting to see if he was about to regret it. Come back tomorrow morning, he said. 7 o'clock. You work a full day? I see what you can do. We talk about it after. Eliza looked at him. And if I can't find a place to stay tonight? He said nothing for a moment, then, the bunkhouse has an empty room at the end. It's got a lock on it. You'd be separate from the men. She held his eyes for a long moment, trying to find the catch in it, the Halverson-style generosity that turned out to be something else entirely. She didn't find it. Maybe she was wrong. She'd been wrong before. 7 o'clock, she said. She unhitched her wagon inside the gate, and for the first time in 4 months, she slept under a roof that didn't belong to a hotel. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't a surprise. The sounds of the ranch settled into her awareness one by one. The occasional movement of cattle in the near pasture, the particular creaking of an unfamiliar building adjusting to the night temperature, voices from somewhere in the main house that she couldn't make out but could track by pitch and rhythm. Someone was angry about something. She lay on the narrow bunk in the locked room at the end of the bunkhouse and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she'd do if tomorrow turned out to be another version of today. There was a point, she thought, where hope became a liability, where it cost you more to keep carrying it than it would cost to put it down. She hadn't reached that point yet. She wanted to believe she hadn't reached it, but it was closer than it used to be, and the distance between here and there had been shortening in a way she couldn't ignore. She was still awake at midnight when she heard boots on the ground outside, passing the bunkhouse at a steady, deliberate pace. Not patrol, not emergency, just someone who couldn't sleep either, working it off by walking. She tracked the sound until it faded. At 5 in the morning, she got up, folded her blanket, smoothed the bunk, and went to find out what the day was going to cost her. She found the barn before she found any people. That was her usual habit. Get a sense of a place by looking at the things that couldn't talk back or form an opinion. The barn told her things. It was clean in a way that required daily attention, not just occasional tidying. The tools were organized with the logic of someone who actually used them, not displayed. The animals were healthy. The feed storage was well maintained and rationed rather than haphazard. This was a ranch that worked because someone made it work, not because it had ever been easy. She was in the middle of examining the hoof of a limping cow she'd found in the smaller back pen. Same issue as the horse, different foot, different stone. When she heard someone come into the barn behind her. It wasn't Wyatt Callahan, it was a boy. 11 or 12, maybe, with the kind of thin, alert face that belonged to a kid who'd learned to pay attention to rooms before walking all the way into them. He stopped when he saw her, not afraid exactly, but not easy either. "Who are you?" he asked. "Eliza Monroe, I'm working a trial day." "My uncle hired you?" So that was the shape of things. She filled it in a little. "He gave me a chance to prove something. Whether that becomes hired is still to be determined." The boy thought about this with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "What are you doing to Maisie?" "Maisie has a stone in her foot. Same problem as the bay out front had yesterday, except Maisie's been walking on hers longer and it's had more time to cause trouble." She kept working as she talked, careful and steady, the cow shifting but not fighting her. "She's been limping for at least 4 days, I'd guess." "6, the boy said. "I noticed 6 days ago. Told Reuben." "Reuben is?" "Head ranch hand. He said she'd work it out." I was wrong. The stone came free. Not as clean as the horse's had been. There was visible damage to the underlying tissue. Not severe, but real. "This needs cleaning and wrapping, and she needs to be off this foot for a few days. You have carbolic and clean cotton cloth somewhere?" The boy looked at her for another moment, still doing whatever calculus he was doing. Then he went to the supply cabinet at the back of the barn and started looking. His name, she learned over the next 40 minutes as they worked together to clean and dress Maisie's foot, was Thomas. He was Wyatt Callahan's nephew, which meant he was the child of someone who wasn't here, and she didn't ask. He was quiet in the good way, not the sullen way. He talked when he had something to say, and didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it, which was a quality Eliza had always respected in people of any age. "You know about animals," he said when they were almost done. "I've worked with them most of my life," she said. "Reuben doesn't like people who know things he doesn't know," Thomas said. It was a perfectly neutral statement of fact, delivered with the particular clarity that children sometimes had before they learned to soften things for the sake of social ease. "I'll keep that in mind," Eliza said. Wyatt Callahan found them there at 7:15 when he came through the barn to start the day's work. He stopped when he saw Maisie's wrapped foot, and he looked at Eliza and then at Thomas, and then back at the cow. "6 days, Eliza said before he could ask. Thomas noticed. He told Reuben. The look that moved across Wyatt Callahan's face at the name Reuben was complicated and brief, and she filed it away without commenting on it. "What does she need?" he asked. 3 days off her feet if you can manage it. The dressing changed daily. If it doesn't start looking better in 4 days, get someone who knows what they're looking at to come check it." He nodded. He stood there a moment longer, looking at his cow, and then he looked at Eliza with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Not pity, not mockery, not the labored patience of someone waiting for her to finish talking so they could say no. Something like assessment, the real kind, where the conclusion wasn't already written. "There's a problem with the south fence," he said. "I'll show you what needs doing." He turned and walked out of the barn, and Eliza followed him, and Thomas came behind them both. And none of them said anything about what any of it meant, because out here the meaning of things was proved in the doing of them and not the saying, and they all understood that well enough to leave the words alone. The morning was cold and the work was hard, and Reuben, a compact, square-built man in his 40s with the stubborn look of someone who'd been in charge long enough to feel ownership of that fact, watched her from across the pasture with an expression that wasn't quite open hostility, but was one long, careful look from becoming it. She'd dealt with Reubens before. So bent to the fence post and got to work, and the cold wind came down off the ridge, and somewhere across the pasture the limping cow was resting on 3 good feet in the small back pen, and Eliza Monroe, who had been laughed at in Red Hollow, and turned away from 3 ranches, and had done the arithmetic on her coin tin in a way that never came out right, was somewhere that felt for the first time in a very long time like it might become something. She wasn't sure of that. She'd been fooled by mornings before. But she got up, and she stayed, and she worked. That was where everything began. The south fence took most of the morning, and by the time Eliza had finished the 3rd section, her hands were raw from the wire, and her back was telling her things she already knew about the difference between a night on a narrow bunk and actual sleep. She didn't mention either of these facts to anyone. There was no version of that conversation that ended well. Wyatt worked alongside her for the first hour, not speaking much, which she appreciated. He had the quality of a man who understood that silence on a job site was not unfriendliness but efficiency, and he moved with the practiced economy of someone who had been doing physical work long enough that it had stopped requiring conscious thought. She watched him without appearing to watch him, the way she'd learned to gather information in situations where asking questions directly would be taken as something other than curiosity. What she gathered, he was not a man who delegated the work he didn't want to do. He was out here in the cold fixing fence the same as she was, which meant something about how he ran things. He'd built this place with his hands, or rebuilt it, or kept it from falling apart through some combination of stubbornness and daily labor that had worn grooves into him. She recognized that quality. It was the same one she saw in the mirror on the morning she could bring herself to look. Reuben appeared at the edge of the pasture at 9:30. He stood there for a moment, watching them work, and then he walked over with the deliberate pace of a man who had something to say and had been rehearsing it. He directed himself entirely to Wyatt. "She finished the east section wrong," he said. "Tension's off. Wind comes through here hard in November. It'll pull." Wyatt looked at him. Then he looked at the section Eliza had finished. Then back at Reuben. "Show me." Reuben walked to the section and pointed to a splice she'd made 2 posts from the end. She watched him point to it and explain, using the language of a man who knew his subject and also knew exactly how to use that knowledge to make another person small. "I've seen ranch hands from back east do it this way," Reuben said. "Works fine in soft country. Out here it doesn't hold." The implication was layered and deliberate. Back east, soft country, fine but not right. And by extension, she didn't belong here. Wyatt turned to Eliza, not to validate Reuben's point, just looking at her, waiting. "He's right about the tension," she said, because he was, and because she wasn't going to pretend otherwise for the sake of her pride. "I've been doing it the way I learned in Missouri. If the wind loads differently here, I need to know that." Reuben blinked. That wasn't the response he'd been prepared for. "Show me what the correct tension looks like on this wire," she said to him directly. "I'd rather fix it now than have it go in November." There was a pause. Reuben looked at Wyatt, who offered him nothing, no rescue, no agreement, just that same waiting expression. Then Reuben looked back at Eliza, and she watched him recalculate, watched him try to find the angle in a situation that had suddenly stopped cooperating with the shape he'd expected it to take. He showed her. She learned. She redid the splice his way, and it was better, and she said so out loud so there would be no ambiguity about who'd known the right method and who'd needed to be corrected. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to disarm a man who expected defensiveness was to give him none. Reuben walked away looking like a person who'd arrived at a fight and found nothing to hit. Wyatt waited until he was out of earshot. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "He was right," Eliza said. "He was also being an ass about it." "Those 2 things can both be true at the same time." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the edges of one. Then he went back to the fence. They broke at noon, and she followed the ranch hands to the cookhouse, which was a separate structure behind the main house, long and low, with a table that seated 12 and currently seated 9, counting herself. She took the open spot at the far end, and no one moved to make her feel welcome, and no one moved to make her feel unwelcome either, which was a kind of neutral ground she knew how to navigate. The ranch hands ate and talked among themselves. She listened and learned names and the approximate shape of the hierarchy. There were 5 full-time hands, and Reuben, who sat at the head of the table opposite Wyatt, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd been there long enough to have opinions about everything. The youngest hand was maybe 17, a kid named Cass who had the eager, slightly chaotic energy of a person who hadn't yet decided whether he wanted to be good at this job or just appear to be. He was the only one who looked at Eliza directly and said, without any particular agenda, "You were out on South Fence this morning?" "Yes," she said. "That's the worst section," he said, with the cheerful certainty of someone stating a known fact. "Been the worst section since before I got here. Wyatt keeps meaning to replace the whole run and keeps having something more urgent come up." "Cass," Reuben said without looking up from his plate. Cass went back to his food. Eliza ate her meal and didn't say anything else and watched, the way she always watched, building the picture from the pieces people left lying around when they forgot, or didn't care that someone was paying attention. The afternoon's work was the water trough in the north pasture, which had developed a slow leak that was wasting more water than the ranch could afford over a dry winter. Wyatt had patched it twice, and it kept coming back, which meant the patch was addressing the symptom, but not the source. She found the source in about 20 minutes. A hairline fracture in the trough's base that had been there long enough that the wood around it had started to soften, which was why the patches kept failing. The water was getting under the patch and continuing to compromise the surrounding material, she told Wyatt. He crouched beside her and looked at what she was pointing to and said, "That's going to mean replacing the whole base." "Either now or in February," she said. "In February the ground will be frozen and you'll have thirsty cattle." He was quiet for a moment. "Can you do it?" "If you have the lumber." "There's stock in the barn. I was saving it for the bunkhouse repairs." "The bunkhouse will keep until spring," she said. "The cattle can't wait." He looked at the trough, and then at her, and she could see him running the math on a dozen things at once. Supplies, labor, timing, the list of things that always outpaced the capacity to address them. "All right," he said. "After supper." She worked on the trough base until the light failed, and then by lantern light until Wyatt came out and told her to stop. "You'll ruin your eyes," he said. "I'm almost through the third board." "Tomorrow." She looked up at him. He was holding a second lantern, and he'd brought a coat, which he set on the edge of the trough without comment. Not for her, technically, just there. She put down her tools and picked up the coat. "Thank you," she said. "You're freezing," he said, as if stating the plain logistics of the situation rather than doing anything as complicated as caring about it. Then he went back to the house. She stood there for a moment in the dark with the lantern casting its unsteady circle and the coat around her shoulders, and she thought about the trough and the cattle and the 18 things still on the list for tomorrow, and she thought about Reuben's face when she'd asked him to teach her the right way to do the splice. Small victories. She'd learned not to need the large ones. The second day was harder in ways the first hadn't been, because the first day people left her alone out of uncertainty, and the second day they'd made up their minds about how they felt. The ranch hands had sorted themselves overnight into two rough categories, the ones who were going to wait and see, and the ones who had already decided. The ones who'd decided were not on her side, and Reuben was their weather vane. It wasn't overt. Men like Reuben never made it overt when there was a cleaner option. It came out in the assignments he gave when Wyatt wasn't present. The heaviest work, the tasks that had been sitting at the bottom of the list, because they were unpleasant rather than urgent. The jobs that weren't quite dangerous but were close enough to that line that only someone paying attention would notice. She did notice. She did the work. By the third day, one of the wait-and-see hands, a quiet man in his 40s named Dell, who had the kind of deliberate, careful quality of someone who'd been burnt before and moved accordingly, arrived at the water trough while she was finishing the fourth board and handed her a different mallet without being asked. "That one's been working loose for a week," he said, nodding at the one in her hand. "Head's gonna fly off." She looked at the mallet. He was right. "Thank you," she said. Dell nodded and leaned against the fence post and watched her work, not helping, just present. It was the kind of company that didn't demand anything, and she found she didn't mind it. "Reuben's been here 11 years, Dell said, after a while. "I gathered," Eliza said. "He built the bunkhouse. Third section of it, anyway. The part you're staying in." She heard what he was telling her. Reuben didn't just work here. He'd put himself into this place, the way you put yourself into something and then couldn't separate the thing from the fact of your having made it. Her presence in the room he'd built was not neutral. It was a kind of argument about what this place was and who had the right to be in it. "Wyatt brought you in without asking him," Dell added. "Wyatt runs the ranch," Eliza said. "He does," Dell agreed, with the tone of a man who found the full truth of a situation slightly more complicated than any single sentence could hold. They left it there. The trough was finished by the afternoon of the fourth day, and when the cattle in the north pasture found the clean, full water and drank, Eliza watched them from the fence and felt something she recognized as satisfaction, which was different from happiness and more reliable. Happiness depended on other people. Satisfaction was between you and the work. Thomas appeared beside her on the fence rail, apparently from nowhere, in the way children had of simply manifesting in places. "Maisie's foot looks better," he said. "Good. I changed the dressing this morning, like you showed me." She looked at him. He was staring at the cattle with the same focused attention she'd noticed in him from the first day, the quality of a kid who took things seriously and understood that taking them seriously was not the same as being solemn about it. "You did a good job with it," she said. "I've been watching how you do things," he said. It wasn't flattery. It was a statement of practice, the same way he'd noted the number of days Maisie had been limping, as information. "What have you noticed?" she asked, genuinely curious. Thomas thought about it. "You don't get mad when things don't work right," he said. "You just look at them differently, like there's always another way to try." Eliza watched the cattle drinking. "You get mad when things don't work right?" she asked. "I used to," he said. "It didn't help." She looked at him sideways. "How old are you?" 12. 12, and he'd already figured out that anger at circumstances was a resource that had to be spent carefully. She wondered what it had cost him to learn it. She didn't ask. The fourth evening, she was at the workbench outside the barn when she heard voices from the direction of the main house. Not the normal after-supper drift of conversation, but something sharper. Two people in the kind of disagreement that kept finding new directions to travel instead of settling. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't try. She went back to the harness she was mending, her own, which she hadn't had the time to attend to, and worked until the voices went quiet. Later, Wyatt came out to the barn, which he did most evenings to check the animals before turning in. She'd learned that about him in 4 days. He had a circuit he made, barn, north fence, cookhouse, to make sure the fire was banked. And he made it every night without variation, which told her he was a man whose sense of security came from having checked things himself rather than having been told they were fine. He stopped when he saw her at the workbench. "Lamp oil's not free," he said. "I know. I'll account for it." "I wasn't asking you to account for it." He came closer and looked at the harness she was mending, and she could tell he recognized it as hers rather than ranch property because his expression shifted slightly. "You don't have to do that out here." "Better light than in the room," she said. He looked at the repair. It was good work. She knew it was good work because she'd had a lot of practice with harnesses that needed mending and not enough money to replace them. He didn't say that. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at it, and the silence had a different quality than the silences earlier in the week. "You were talking to Dell today," he said finally. "He told me about Reuben." "What about Reuben?" "That he's been here 11 years, she said, that he built the bunkhouse, that you brought me in without consulting him." Wyatt was quiet. "He's not wrong to be bothered," Eliza said. "You changed his situation without asking him about it. Men who've invested in a place take that personally." "Are you defending him?" "I'm explaining him. It's different." She tied off the mending and turned it over to look at the other side. "He's going to keep being a problem until you actually talk to him. Not about me specifically, about what I'm doing here and whether it has anything to do with his position." "It doesn't." "He doesn't know that." Wyatt made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't disagreement either. The sound of a man recognizing something he'd been not quite thinking about. He stood there another moment. "You've been here 4 days," he said. "I have." "And you've already got opinions about how I run things." She looked up at him. "You asked me to show you what I can do. I don't know how to do that without also seeing things." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense again of being actually assessed, not measured against some fixed standard she'd never been told about, but looked at as a specific person whose specific qualities were being considered on their own terms. It was still unfamiliar enough to be slightly disorienting. "My grandmother wants to meet you," he said. Eliza hadn't known there was a grandmother. She filed the information away. "All right. Tomorrow, supper, if you're willing." "I'm willing." He nodded. He finished his circuit of the barn, checked each stall with the automatic thoroughness of habit, and left. She listened to his footsteps cross the yard and die away toward the house. She sat at the workbench for another few minutes with the finished harness in her hands and thought about 4 days. 4 days ago, she'd been standing outside the Red Hollow Cattlemen's Exchange with a grinding wheel bearing and coins she'd counted too many times. 4 days was not a long time. It was not enough time to know what anything meant or whether any of it would hold, but the trough was full and Maisie's foot was healing and Thomas had changed the dressing right. She put out the lamp and went to bed. Margaret Callahan was not what Eliza had expected, which told her she'd been forming expectations from not enough information, which was a habit she tried to guard against and still fell into. She'd imagined, based on nothing more solid than instinct, some version of a rancher's grandmother, weathered, practical, economical with words. What she found, when Wyatt brought her into the main house's sitting room before supper, was a woman of about 75 who was sitting straight-backed in a chair that she made look like a throne by the simple act of occupying it, as though she'd always been there and the chair had been built around her. Margaret Callahan had white hair pinned with an efficiency that suggested she didn't spend much time on it, and the eyes of a person who had been watching people for 7 decades and had excellent records. "Sit down," she said to Eliza, and gestured at the chair across from her. Eliza sat. Wyatt excused himself to check something in the kitchen, which Eliza suspected was less about the kitchen and more about leaving the two of them to whatever this was going to be. Margaret looked at her. It was a direct look, not unfriendly, but not warm, the look of someone who had not yet decided and was not going to pretend otherwise. "My grandson says you fixed the north trough," she said. "The base needed replacing. Reuben patched it twice. He was patching over a fracture in the base. The water kept getting under." Margaret absorbed this. "Reuben doesn't like you," she said, with the frank simplicity of someone who'd decided life was too short for approaches. "I know," Eliza said. "Do you know why? Some of it is what I am. Some of it is how I arrived without him having any say. Some of it is probably things I don't know about yet." Margaret studied her. "You're not what I expected," she said. "People usually aren't," Eliza said. Something shifted in the old woman's expression. Not a smile, but a movement toward one. "Wyatt said you came from Missouri." "Worked there the last 3 years. Before that, Indiana." "Alone?" "Yes." Margaret was quiet a moment. "That's a hard way to travel." "It's the way I had," Eliza said. The old woman looked at her hands, then back at her face. The assessment was not unkind, but it was thorough. Eliza stayed still under it and let herself be looked at, which was a thing she'd had a lot of practice with for all the wrong reasons, and had only recently started learning to do without the reflex of wanting to disappear. "Wyatt's mother was the same way," Margaret said, finally, as though arriving at a conclusion through a route she hadn't planned. "Came out here from Ohio with nothing but a wagon and more stubbornness than sense. My son didn't know what to do with her either at first." She paused. "He figured it out eventually." It was not a declaration of anything, but it wasn't nothing either. Supper was quieter than Eliza had expected. Wyatt ate with the focused pragmatism of a man who treated meals as fuel rather than events, and Margaret asked precise questions about the ranch's current state, the south fence, the water situation, the cattle count, with the manner of someone who had every right to be briefed and expected to be. Thomas ate quickly and disappeared, which appeared to be his established pattern. Afterward, Eliza helped clear the table, and Margaret watched her do it without comment, which was itself a kind of comment. Walking back to the bunkhouse, Eliza felt the cold settle in around her with the weight of a real autumn, the kind that was rehearsing for winter. She looked up at the sky, which was clear enough that the stars had all turned out. She stood there for a moment, which she didn't usually allow herself because standing still in the cold looking at stars was an activity that led to thoughts she'd learned to be careful about. The ones about permanence, about belonging, about the difference between a place you were in and a place that was yours. She went inside. The next morning, Reuben assigned her to the cattle sorting in the east pasture, which needed to be done before the vet came at noon to look at 2 steers that had been showing signs of something respiratory. She understood the assignment for what it was. Not quite an olive branch, not quite a test, but the closest thing to neutral ground Reuben had offered so far. She took it as it was given, without reading more into it. The sorting was hard, physical work that required the particular combination of strength and patience that cattle consistently demanded of people who weren't paying close enough attention. The animals weren't cooperative and weren't trying to be difficult. They were just cattle, with cattle's relationship to the concept of going where humans wanted them to go. She worked with Cass, who approached the job with the earnest, chaotic energy she'd already cataloged in him, and with Dell, who worked the way he did everything, quietly and effectively. About an hour in, Cass got pushed against the fence by a steer coming through fast, and he went down in the mud and came up swearing. Eliza had the steer redirected before Cass was fully back on his feet. Not by force, she didn't have the mass for force with an animal that size. But by positioning, stepping into the line the animal was most likely to take next, and changing what looked like available space. The steer turned and went where she needed it. Cass stared at her, covered in mud, trying to recalibrate whatever he'd thought about what had just happened. "You all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said, in the tone of someone who was fine and surprised to be. He looked at where the steer had gone, and then at her, and some piece of his working theory of Eliza Monroe underwent revision. "How'd you know it was going right?" "I didn't," she said honestly. "I picked the direction I thought it was more likely to go, and I was there before it decided." Cass turned this over. "What if you'd been wrong?" "Then I'd have been wrong, and we'd have dealt with it." He thought about this with the focus of a person encountering a philosophy they hadn't previously considered. "Reuben always says you gotta know what the animal's gonna do before it does it." "That's one way," Eliza said. "The other way is to know what you're going to do and commit to it fast enough that the animal has to respond to you instead of the other way around." Dell, who had been listening from the other side of the pen, made a sound that might have been agreement and might have been something else entirely. The vet arrived at noon. A woman in her 50s named Hartwell, who drove a wagon that showed the particular organized chaos of someone who carried their entire practice with them at all times. She looked at the two sick steers, asked brisk questions, wrote a course of treatment on a piece of paper, and handed it to Wyatt. Then she looked at Eliza with a different kind of attention. "You're the one who redressed Maisie's foot?" she asked. "Yes," Eliza said. "Good work. Saved the tissue." It was said in exactly the tone that Dell handed her the mallet. Matter of fact, unembellished, simply true. It was the most direct compliment she'd received in longer than she could precisely remember, and it hit her harder than she let show, which was another thing she'd had a lot of practice with. Wyatt was watching her. She didn't look at him. Hartwell left, and the afternoon passed, and supper came and went. By the end of the week, her 7th day on the Callahan ranch, the shape of things had shifted in small but real ways. Cass no longer looked at her as if she were a temporary phenomenon. Dell had started talking to her with the natural ease he used with people he'd decided were worth the trouble. Margaret had begun appearing at the cookhouse door at supper in a way that suggested she intended to be present rather than absent, which was a change Thomas had noticed and regarded with cautious interest. Reuben watched all of it and said nothing, which was more unsettling than anything he'd said aloud. The actual conversation with Wyatt happened on the 8th morning. He found her at the barn before the rest of the ranch was fully moving, which told her he'd chosen the time deliberately. "I want to make this permanent," he said. "Actual wages. A real position." Eliza kept working on the piece of harness she'd picked up. "Doing what?" "What you've been doing. Animal care, facilities, whatever comes up." He paused. "We'd need to figure out the arrangement so it doesn't create more problems with the men than it's worth." She looked at him then. "Is it worth problems?" "I think so," he said. "Not you are, but the work is," which was, she thought, actually the more honest framing of it, and therefore the more respectful one. She would have been suspicious of anything more personal at this stage. She was suspicious enough of this. "Reuben," she said. "I'll talk to him." "Have you talked to him yet?" Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. "Not yet." "He needs to hear it from you before he hears it from circumstances," she said. "The longer that conversation waits, the worse it goes." "I know that." "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Is that a yes?" "It's an okay," she said. "To the idea. Talk to Reuben first. Then we see." Wyatt nodded. He started to leave and then stopped. "My grandmother asked if you'd have supper at the house again Friday." Eliza looked at him. "She asked," he said, with the careful neutrality of a man passing along a message and nothing else. "I'm just telling you." "Tell her yes," Eliza said. He left. She stayed with the harness and the morning and the particular quiet of a barn before the day fully arrived, and she tried not to build too much from 8 days and a question about supper, because she'd built things from less and watched them fall, and she knew how the weight of a thing you'd wanted too badly could warp your reading of it. She'd been wrong before, but the trough was full and the water was clean, and outside the barn she could hear Thomas talking to Maisie in the small back pen, telling the cow something in the low, even voice of a kid who'd decided that talking to animals was worth doing even if no one was listening, which was the kind of faith in simple acts that Eliza had once had and lost and was, slowly and with considerable skepticism, beginning to find her way back toward. The conversation with Reuben happened that same afternoon. She wasn't there for it. She didn't need to be. She was in the north pasture, checking the repaired trough and watching the water level. She'd been watching it daily, making sure the seal held, when she saw, across the distance, Wyatt and Reuben standing outside the main barn in the posture of two people in a conversation that mattered. She could tell it mattered by the way neither of them was moving. Hard conversations made people still, in her experience. Movement was what you did when things were easy. It lasted maybe 20 minutes. She watched the cattle drink and didn't look toward the barn again. Supper, Reuben sat at the head of the table as he always did, and he ate and he talked to Dell about the south pasture rotation, and at one point he passed the bread down to Eliza's end of the table without being asked, and without any particular expression on his face. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was bread. But it was a start, and she knew better than to want more than that from 8 days and one conversation. She took the bread and ate it, and the table talked around her in the familiar way of a group that was beginning, incrementally and without announcement, to rearrange itself to include a new fixed point. And outside the window, the early dark of approaching winter had settled over the ranch, and in the north pasture the water trough held. November arrived the way it always did in that part of the country. Not gradually, not with the slow golden warnings of late October fading into something harder, but all at once, like a door closing. One morning the ground was firm, and the air had the sharp, clean bite of early cold, and the next morning the frost was on everything, and the cattle were bunched at the windbreak, and you could see in the way the horses stood at the fence that they'd felt the change before any person had. Eliza felt it too, in the way her hands stiffened in the mornings, and in the way the bunkhouse room, which was drafty in a manner she'd identified as a problem with the window frame rather than the wall, dropped cold enough before dawn that she'd started sleeping in her outer clothes. She'd mentioned the window frame to no one. She'd found some extra batting in the supply barn and packed it herself, which was not a perfect solution, but was the kind of imperfect solution she'd built her entire life out of. 3 weeks had passed since Wyatt had asked her to stay, and she'd said okay instead of yes. In those 3 weeks, the ranch had moved from the particular unsteadiness of late autumn into the grinding business of preparing for winter, and Eliza had moved with it, learning the rhythms of the Callahan operation the same way she learned every operation, by paying attention to what actually happened rather than what anyone said was supposed to happen. What actually happened on the Callahan ranch was this. The cattle count was healthy, but the grazing rotation had been mismanaged over the summer, which meant the south pasture was thinner than it should have been going into a cold season. And if the winter ran long, they'd be supplementing with stored hay earlier than the supply could comfortably support. This was not a crisis. It was the kind of slow-developing problem that became a crisis if you didn't start addressing it 6 weeks before it required emergency measures. She'd put the observation in front of Wyatt at the end of her second week, on paper, with numbers, in the straightforward language of someone who understood that a problem stated clearly was easier to act on than a problem stated apologetically. He'd read it. He'd thought about it. He'd started adjusting the rotation. Reuben had read it too, because Wyatt had shared it with him, and Reuben's response to it had been silence of a different quality than the silence before, and not the stubborn silence of a man refusing to give ground, but the somewhat unwilling silence of a man who couldn't find a reason to argue with the arithmetic. Small victories. Still the small ones, but she was getting better at recognizing them without diminishing them. The problem that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a man in a good coat. She was in the small back pen with Thomas, who had taken over Maisie's ongoing care with the quiet dedication of a kid who'd found something he was good at and had no intention of letting go of it. Maisie's foot had healed cleanly. Hartwell had confirmed it on her follow-up visit, with the same matter-of-fact brevity she brought to everything. And Thomas had started extending his attention to the other animals in the pen with the focused curiosity of someone who discovered that the more you looked, the more there was to see. Eliza was showing him how to check a calf's teeth for age and condition when she heard the wagon come through the front gate. She didn't look up immediately. Wagons came through. It was a working ranch. But something in the quality of the sound made her pay attention. The pace of it, too deliberate. The kind of pace that said the driver was making an entrance rather than an arrival. She looked up. The wagon was expensive. Not ostentatiously so. This wasn't a man who wanted to look wealthy so much as a man who was wealthy and bought things that reflected it without calling attention to it, which was in some ways a more sophisticated kind of display. The horse pulling it was better than anything on the Callahan ranch. The man driving it was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the particular posture of someone who had spent enough years being the most important person in any room that it had become the default position of his spine. "Who's that?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," Eliza said, but she filed the image away because she had learned a long time ago that the people who arrived with that quality of intention were worth filing away. She found out at supper. The man's name was Harlan Geary, and he was, as Cass explained with the breathless authority of someone who'd been listening at the edges of conversations he wasn't invited into, the largest landowner in 2 counties. He'd been buying up grazing land for 3 years, quietly, systematically, through a combination of direct purchase and what Cass described as the other kind, which was the kind where you made conditions difficult enough that selling became the easier option. "What does he want with Callahan?" Dell asked, with the careful neutrality of a man who already had ideas. "Water," Reuben said, from the head of the table. Everyone looked at him. It was the first time he'd contributed to a supper conversation that included Eliza in 3 weeks. "The South Creek runs through Callahan land before it hits the Geary parcels," Reuben said. "Geary's been after that water access for 2 years. Wyatt's turned him down twice." "What's different this time?" Eliza asked. Reuben looked at her. It was a direct look, not hostile, which itself was a kind of change. "Man like Geary doesn't take no for an answer," he said. "He just figures out a different question to ask." The table was quiet after that. Wyatt didn't come to supper that night. Margaret ate with them instead, which she'd never done before, and the fact of her at the cookhouse table with the ranch hands said something. None of them were going to say out loud about how seriously she was taking whatever conversation was happening in the main house. Eliza watched Margaret eat with the straight-backed composure she brought to everything and thought about what Reuben had said. A different question. She turned it over while she ate and didn't like the shape of what it implied. She found out the shape 3 days later, when the first notice arrived. It came by way of a man from the county land office, a clerk, by the look of him, uncomfortable on horseback and clearly wishing he was somewhere else, who delivered a folded document to Wyatt at the front gate and left as quickly as his horse would take him. She saw Wyatt read it at the gate, saw the particular stillness that came over him, and knew from 20 feet away that the document contained something that was going to change the character of the next several months. She went back to what she'd been doing. She wasn't part of that conversation yet. She'd wait to be brought into it or not, and either way she'd keep working, because the cattle didn't care about land disputes and the south pasture rotation still needed managing. It was Margaret who brought her into it. She came to the barn that evening while Eliza was doing the last check before dark, and she carried herself with the purposeful quality of someone who had made a decision about where to spend her energy and was not interested in spending any of it on preamble. "Geary's filed a water rights claim," she said. "Says the creek boundary was misregistered in 1871 and the access point legally falls on his parcel." Eliza set down what she was holding. "Does it?" "The original survey is 40 years old and the copy the county has is not what I'd call reliable," Margaret said, which is apparently what Geary's counting on. "Is there another copy?" Margaret looked at her in a way that said she'd been waiting for precisely that question. "My husband kept records. Box of them. In the study." She paused. "Wyatt knows they exist. He hasn't looked at them in 10 years. "Why not?" The old woman was quiet for a moment. "Because the last time he looked at them was the week after his father died," she said. "And some things you don't go back to until you have a reason that's bigger than the reason not to." Eliza absorbed this. "He needs to look at them now." "Yes," Margaret said. "I know that. I'm not sure he's ready to hear it from me." She met Eliza's eyes directly. "I thought he might hear it differently from someone without 40 years of family history attached to the suggestion." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived, and it landed with the weight of something that had been carefully considered before being offered. "I'll talk to him," Eliza said. She found Wyatt in the study that same night, sitting at the desk with the land notice in front of him and the expression of a man staring at a problem from 3 different angles and not liking any of the views. He looked up when she knocked on the open door. "Your grandmother said there are survey records," Eliza said, "from your grandfather's time." "There are." "Have you looked at them since the claim was filed?" "No." She waited. "They're in the box behind you," he said, without moving. She turned. The box was on a shelf behind the door, a flat wooden crate, the kind that had been made to last, with a hasp that had gone green at the edges. She looked at it, then at him. "Do you want me to look through them?" He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she understood it wasn't about her question. Then he stood up, came around the desk, lifted the box down from the shelf, and set it on the desk between them. He didn't open it immediately. He stood with his hands on either side of it and looked at it. "My father knew where every boundary on this land ran," he said. "He could have walked any of them in the dark. He and my grandfather surveyed the whole property twice, 10 years apart, checked everything." A pause. He would have known exactly what to say to Geary. "You'll know it too," Eliza said, "once you see what's in here." He opened the box. The contents were what decades of careful documentation looked like. Folded papers, ledger pages, notes in 2 distinct handwriting styles, maps with annotations in pencil that had faded to the edge of legibility. Not chaos, but the organized density of a person who'd recorded things as they happened rather than organizing them after the fact. They worked through the box together, Wyatt handling the older documents with a deliberateness that she understood was not just care for fragile paper. She sorted and cataloged as they went, making a list in the ledger she'd started keeping for ranch records in her 3rd week, building a picture of what was there. The original survey documents, the county registration from 1869, a letter from the county surveyor dated 1872 with hand-drawn corrections to the property line annotations. A second copy of the water access agreement, this one signed and witnessed, that differed in one specific and critical measurement from the county copy. She stopped when she found it. "Wyatt." He looked up. She laid the document on the desk beside the county notice and pointed to the measurement. The county notice cited a boundary point 60 feet east of the creek fork. The document in her hand put the same boundary point 30 feet west of the creek fork. 90 feet. The entire dispute was about 90 feet of land on paper, and what those 90 feet meant for the water access that fed 2 pastures, and what that water meant for whether the Callahan Ranch was a viable operation or not. Wyatt looked at the 2 documents for a long time. "This is your grandfather's signature," Eliza said, pointing to the witnessed copy. "And these 2 witnesses, do you know who they were?" "Jesse Hartwell," he read. "That's the vet's father. He died 8 years ago." He traced the second name. "Clara Fenwick. She's the wife of the man who owns the general store. She'd be in her 80s now." "She's alive?" "Last I knew." Eliza looked at him. "The county copy has a recording error," she said, as plainly as she could, because plainness was what this moment needed and not anything more complicated. "This document is the correct record. If you can get Hartwell's daughter and Clara Fenwick to confirm what they know about their family's involvement in the original survey, and if you take this to the county land office with the discrepancy documented, Geary's claim falls apart." Wyatt sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. It was the posture of a man absorbing something that required a moment to absorb. Not the problem, but the fact that there was a solution, which was sometimes the harder thing to take in. "It won't be fast," he said. "No, these things don't move fast. And Geary will push back. He'll push back hard," she agreed. "He has money and he has patience and he's done this before, but he's also counting on you not having the documentation to challenge him, and you have the documentation." A long silence. "You're good at this," Wyatt said. "At what?" "Looking at something that seems overwhelming and finding the specific thing that matters." She didn't say anything to that. She closed the ledger and squared the papers into 2 piles, the ones they'd need and the ones they wouldn't, and left the documentation where Wyatt could work with it. But that was not the end of what Harlan Geary had planned, because Harlan Geary had not built what he'd built by depending on a single approach. The secondary pressure began the following week, and it came not from Geary directly, but from the town, or rather from the particular layer of the town that had always been most sensitive to the opinions of powerful men. She felt it first at the feed store, where a transaction that had always been straightforward took on a new quality of hesitation, where the owner, a man named Price, not Deacon Price from the Cattlemen's Exchange, but his younger brother, which told her something about how far Geary's influence extended, found reasons to be occupied when she came in and let his assistant handle her order with an excessive carefulness that communicated discomfort without ever saying a word she could point to. She heard it second from Cass, who had the useful property of being young enough that people underestimated how much he was listening. He came back from town on a supply run with a look she'd learned to read, the look of a person who'd heard things he didn't know whether to repeat. "What?" she said. He told her. The word in town, apparently, was that Wyatt Callahan had hired someone unsuitable, that the presence of a woman like her at the ranch was an embarrassment to a family that had always held a respectable position in the county, and that Wyatt must be struggling worse than anyone realized to have made a choice like that. The language used, as filtered through Cass's uncertain recollection, had a specific quality she recognized. Not crude, which was the honest kind of contempt, but refined, which was the kind designed to spread. "Who's saying it?" she asked. Cass named two names. Both of them, she knew from her weeks of listening and building the picture, had business relationships with Geary. She thanked Cass and went back to what she'd been doing and tried to identify the things she was feeling, because naming it accurately was the first step to not being controlled by it. It was not surprise. She'd spent enough years being the subject of the refined kind of contempt to have stopped being surprised by it. It was something older and more structural, the particular fatigue of knowing that your presence in a place could be used as a weapon against the people who'd chosen to include you, and that there was nothing you could do to prevent that except leave, which was its own kind of losing. She did not go to Wyatt with it. She went to Margaret. The old woman was in the sitting room, which was where she spent most mornings, and she looked up when Eliza came in with the expression of someone who'd already known this conversation was coming and had been waiting for it to arrive. "You've heard," Eliza said. "This morning," Margaret said, "from Clara Fenwick, who came to tell me herself because she's been in this county 81 years and she knows exactly what Geary is doing and wanted me to know she didn't want any part of it." Eliza sat down. "It's going to get worse." "Yes." "Wyatt's reputation, his position in the county. Geary will use my being here as evidence of bad judgment." "Geary will use whatever he can find," Margaret said. "That's not new information about Geary. The question is what we do with the situation we're actually in." "I could leave," Eliza said. She said it directly because Margaret deserved direct. "If I'm gone, Geary loses that particular angle." Margaret looked at her with an expression that was not unkind but was completely without softness. "And the water rights dispute? That has nothing to do with me." "The documentation you found has everything to do with you," Margaret said. "The list you made, the way you sorted the survey papers and identified the recording error. Wyatt has been looking at that box of documents for 2 days, and he tells me he wouldn't have known what he was looking at without your work." A pause. "You'd leave that behind?" Eliza said nothing. "You'd let Geary tell you where you belong," Margaret said, "after everything you've already survived." The words landed harder than she'd expected, which told her they'd found something she'd been protecting. She looked at the window, at the gray November light coming through it, at the dry grass in the near pasture bending under a wind she could hear but couldn't see. "I've left places before," Eliza said, "when staying cost the people who took me in more than it was worth." "Did they ask you to leave?" "No, but I could see—" "Could you?" Margaret said. "Or could you see a situation that was painful and uncomfortable and call it inevitable because leaving felt simpler than staying?" It was a hard thing to be said. It was also, Eliza acknowledged to herself, not entirely inaccurate. "Thomas cried this morning," Margaret said, in a different tone entirely. Not a manipulation, she said it as a fact, the way she said everything. "He heard what was being said in town, and he didn't say anything to anyone about it, and I found him in the back pen with Maisie at 6 in the morning. He didn't want to explain himself. He's 12 years old, and he doesn't know how to talk about the things that matter most to him yet." She looked at Eliza. "He's watching what you do next." The fire in the hearth moved through its shifts, and Eliza sat with that. She was still sitting with it when Reuben knocked on the sitting room door. He stood in the doorway with the particular posture of a man who had arrived at a position he hadn't expected to occupy, and was going to occupy it anyway, because he'd decided to. He looked at Eliza, not at Margaret. "I owe you something," he said. Eliza waited. "I've been making things harder than they needed to be," he said. "Not because of the work. The work—" He stopped. Tried again. "You do the work right. Better than right, most of the time. I've been making it harder because I didn't want to have to say I was wrong about you, and that's not your problem, it's mine." It was the kind of thing that cost a man like Reuben everything to say, and she knew it, and she received it accordingly. You weren't wrong about everything, she said. The fence splice was wrong. Something moved in Reuben's expression. Not quite a smile, but the thing that preceded one in a person who didn't smile often. The fence splice was wrong, he agreed. We're square, she said. He nodded once and left. Margaret watched the door close after him. 11 years, she said quietly. I know, Eliza said. She made her decision in the sitting room, and she didn't announce it, and she didn't perform it. She went back to the barn, and she worked through the afternoon, and she thought about what she was doing and why, and she came around to the same answer she'd been approaching since the moment Margaret had said Thomas didn't want to explain himself, and she'd understood exactly what that was like. Wyatt found her at the workbench after supper. I know about the talk in town, he said. I know you do. I want you to know it doesn't change anything on my end. I know that too. She looked at him directly. It's going to get worse before the land dispute is resolved. You understand that staying is going to cost you something in the short term. Everything worth doing costs something, he said. It was not a platitude the way he said it. It was a plain statement of the arithmetic of his life to that point, and she heard it that way. Geary's counting on you to be isolated, she said. He's pulling the town toward him because a man fighting a land dispute alone is much easier to outlast than a man with a community behind him. So we don't stay isolated, Wyatt said. No, we don't. She told him what she'd been thinking about, the way the water rights question affected not just the Callahan Ranch, but the 3 smaller operations downstream that shared the same watershed. The way Geary's pattern, if you looked at it over the 3 years of his acquisition campaign, was always to separate landowners from one another before approaching them. The way that pattern only worked if people let it. Wyatt listened the way he always listened, completely, without performing it. There's a meeting in town, he said. Monthly. County Agricultural Association. Next one's in 2 weeks. Everyone attends? Most of the ranchers. Then that's where this conversation starts, she said. Not privately, not one at a time. All of them together, where they can hear each other's concerns and see that they're not each other's competition on this one. He was quiet for a moment. They'll see you there. Yes, she said. They will. He looked at her with the same expression she'd been trying to read since the first day, and had been slowly coming to understand was simply what careful respect looked like on a man who didn't offer it easily. Will you come? She thought about Thomas in the pen with Maisie at 6 in the morning. She thought about Reuben in the doorway. She thought about the fence splice and the trough base and the document in the box that said 90 feet in the right direction. Yes, she said. The 2 weeks before the meeting were the most complicated she'd spent on the Callahan Ranch, and they were complicated in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work. The physical work was straightforward. It was November, and there was always more to do than there was light to do it in. And that was a relief, because the straightforwardness of labor was something she could depend on when everything else was uncertain. What was uncertain was the town. The talk had not gotten better, and she hadn't expected it to, but experiencing a thing and expecting it were different enough that experiencing it still cost her something each time. In town for supplies, she heard the particular quality of silence that replaced conversation when she appeared. Not the silence of rudeness, so much as the silence of people who hadn't decided yet and were waiting to see which way the wind ran. She kept her face neutral and her pace steady, and she bought what was needed and left, and she did not look for the faces she knew and did not look away from them either. The one unexpected development was Clara Fenwick. She was 81 years old and small in the way of very old people who had always been small and had outlived the significance of it. And she came to the ranch on a Thursday morning in the second week, unannounced, in a buggy driven by her granddaughter. She asked for Wyatt, and Wyatt brought her into the study, and Eliza was called in after. Clara Fenwick had been at the original water access survey in 1869. She had been 24 years old. She remembered the day, the surveyor's name, the placement of the boundary markers, the witness signatures she and her late husband had provided. She remembered it with the crystalline specificity of someone who had always known, on some level, that it would matter. She told them everything. Wyatt wrote it down. Eliza helped him frame the questions that drew out the most precise information. When it was over, Clara Fenwick looked at Eliza for a moment with an expression that was not pity and not exactly warmth, but was the kind of considered acknowledgement that older women with good memories sometimes offered to other people who'd had to be tougher than the situation warranted. "You found the document," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "My testimony and that document together are enough," Clara said. "I've spoken to a land attorney in the next county. He agrees." She stood up with the deliberate care of someone who wasn't going to let her age make her movements look diminished. "Harlan Geary has been doing this to people for 3 years. He picked Wyatt because he thought Wyatt was alone." She picked up her coat from the chair. "He was wrong." She left. The granddaughter helped her into the buggy, and they drove back down the road toward town. Wyatt and Eliza stood in the study with the written testimony between them and said nothing for a moment. "2 weeks," Wyatt said. "2 weeks," Eliza agreed. Outside, the wind picked up and moved through the near pasture in the gray November light, and the horses at the fence lifted their heads to it, and the ranch went on doing what it did, which was the stubborn, ongoing work of surviving one day at a time, and for the moment, that was enough. The morning of the County Agricultural Association meeting, Eliza woke before 4 and lay in the dark, listening to the wind work its way through the gap she'd never fully fixed in the bunkhouse window frame. The batting she'd packed in there held against the worst of it, but not all of it, and the cold came through in thin threads that she'd learned to sleep around rather than be bothered by. She'd been sleeping around inconveniences her whole life. One more didn't register the way it used to. She was not afraid of the meeting. She told herself that, and then she examined the statement the way she examined everything, honestly and without the comfort of wishful thinking, and found that it was mostly true. What she felt was not fear exactly, but the particular tension of knowing that the next several hours would require her to be precisely herself in a room full of people who had already decided what that meant, and that there was no version of that which wasn't going to cost something. She got up at 4:30 and went to the barn. Thomas was already there. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him, surprised in the way she was still occasionally surprised by him despite the fact that she should have known better by now. He was sitting on the low bench beside Maisie's stall, not doing anything, just sitting in the lantern light with the particular stillness of a kid who'd run out of ways to manage what he was feeling and had come to be near something that didn't ask him to explain it. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She came in and hung her lantern and started the morning check, moving through the stalls in the order she'd established in her first week. Thomas watched her for a minute and then got up and started the water buckets without being asked, which was how he'd been handling things he didn't want to talk about for the past 3 weeks, finding something useful to do with his hands and doing it. They worked in silence for a while. Outside, the wind pushed at the barn walls, and somewhere in the near pasture, one of the cattle called out once and then was quiet. "People in town say bad things about you," Thomas said to the bucket he was filling. "I know they do." "It's not true." "Some of it isn't," she said. "Some of it is just people seeing what they want to see and calling it what they've decided it is." He looked at her then, the direct look he had that was more adult than most adults managed. "Are you scared? Of today? Of all of it? Of what they'll say? Of what might happen?" She stopped what she was doing and thought about the question seriously, because he deserved a serious answer and not a reassuring one. "I'm not scared the way you mean," she said. "I've been in rooms where people had already made up their minds about me before I walked in. That part I know how to handle." A pause. "What I'm careful about is making sure the things that matter don't get lost in what people are saying about me. The water rights, the documentation, your uncle's position. Those things are more important than whether people in this county decide to like me." Thomas thought about this. "Reuben says you're the most practical person he's ever met." She looked at him. "When did Reuben say that?" "Yesterday, to Dell. He didn't know I was on the other side of the fence. He said it without any pleasure in the overhearing, just reporting what he'd found, the way he reported everything." She went back to the morning check and didn't say anything, but she held the information somewhere and was quietly glad of it. Wyatt came to the barn at 6, which was earlier than his usual circuit. He was already dressed for town. Not formally, because formality wasn't the register of these meetings, but with the particular neatness of a man who understood that how you arrived somewhere told people what you thought of the occasion. He looked at Thomas and then at Eliza. "We leave at 8, he said. "I'll be ready," she said. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then didn't. He checked 3 stalls, adjusted a water bucket that didn't need adjusting, and left. Thomas watched him go. "He's nervous," he said. "He has more to lose today than I do," Eliza said. The boy considered this. "He doesn't think so," he said. "He told my grandmother last night that you had more to lose because you've already lost so much, and you keep going anyway, and that's harder than someone who's never had to practice at it." Eliza stood very still for a moment. "You weren't supposed to hear that either," she said. "I'm 12, Thomas said, with the resigned pragmatism of a child who'd long since accepted that his talent for occupying doorways and fence lines at useful moments was simply a fact about himself. "People don't look for me." She made herself go back to the work because the alternative was standing in the middle of the barn with her throat tight, and she was not going to do that at 5:30 in the morning with a 12-year-old watching. Reuben drove the wagon. This was not incidental. He'd offered the night before, in the same plain way he'd offered the apology in the doorway, without performance or explanation, and Wyatt had accepted in the same register. Dell and Cass stayed at the ranch. Someone had to, and the cattle didn't care about land disputes, as Eliza had noted before, and found it useful to keep noting. Margaret came. The old woman stepped up into the wagon with the deliberate care of her age and settled herself in the front seat beside Reuben as though she'd done it 1,000 times, which Eliza supposed she probably had. She wore her good coat and had her hair pinned the same way it always was, and she looked at the road ahead with an expression that combined composure and intent in equal measure. They didn't talk much on the drive in. The road was frozen hard and the wagon moved over it with the particular crisp sound of wheels on ground that had no give, and the sky was the pale flat gray of a November morning that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. Eliza sat in the back with Wyatt and watched the familiar land move past and thought about the document in the leather case Wyatt was holding, the survey papers, the witness copy, Clara Fenwick's written testimony that they'd had signed before a justice of the peace the week before. She'd made copies of all of it, 2 sets, because she trusted documentation and she trusted redundancy, and she'd learned through enough experiences to trust both of them more than she trusted any single version of anything. The second set was in her coat pocket. Red Hollow's Community Hall was a large timber building at the north end of the main road, functional and plain in the way of structures built to serve a purpose rather than make a statement. When they arrived, there were already a dozen wagons outside, which told her the meeting had drawn the kind of attendance that came from something more than routine agricultural business. Word had gotten out that Geary's claim was on the agenda. People had opinions about Geary, and they'd come to have them in public. She followed Wyatt through the door and felt the room register her arrival, the way rooms had always registered it. Not all at once, but in a spreading ripple, one person noticing, and that noticing catching the peripheral attention of the next, until it had moved through most of the room in the first 30 seconds. She kept her face exactly as it had been when she walked in. She took a seat at the end of the row Wyatt chose, with Margaret on her other side, and she put her hands in her lap and waited. Harlan Geary was already there. She'd seen him once since the first day, at a distance, and up close he confirmed what she'd assessed from 20 feet, a man whose confidence was architectural, built into the structure of how he occupied space. He sat at the front of the room on the right side with 2 other men she didn't know, one of whom had the look of a lawyer, and he acknowledged Wyatt's arrival with the minimal courtesy of someone who was not concerned about the outcome of today. She noticed that. The not concerned quality filed it. The meeting was run by an older rancher named Aldous Webb, who had the weary competence of a man who'd been chairing these meetings for 20 years and had navigated disputes ranging from fence-line arguments to the occasional near-physical confrontation. He called the room to order with the efficiency of practice, moved through the routine business in 15 minutes, and then opened the floor on the water rights question. Geary's lawyer spoke first. He was smooth and thorough and well-prepared, and he made the recording error in the county document sound like an unfortunate administrative matter rather than what it was, and he cited precedents that were real enough that most of the room wouldn't know how to evaluate them. Eliza listened to every word and kept her expression neutral, and made notes on the small pad she'd brought in her pocket. When he finished, Aldous Webb looked at Wyatt. Wyatt stood. He was not a natural public speaker in the sense of someone who enjoyed the room's attention or moved through it with ease. He was a man who said what needed to be said and relied on the accuracy of it to do the work that some people let rhetoric do instead. Eliza had thought, watching him in his own spaces over the weeks, that this was actually a quality that played better in a room of ranchers than fluency would have. They were, by and large, people who trusted plainness and were suspicious of polish. He laid out the water rights dispute without elaboration. The original survey, the recording discrepancy, the 90 feet. He put the document copies on the table at the front where people could see them, and he explained what the difference between the two measurements meant for the water access and for his cattle, and for the 3 downstream operations that shared the same watershed. When he named the downstream operations, something changed in the room. She watched it. The slight shifts, the eye contact between certain people, the recalibration of how this information was being organized. Geary's water rights claim had not been presented to those 3 ranchers as a matter that affected them. They were hearing it now for the first time, from Wyatt, in a room where they were all present together. That was the room she'd told Wyatt to make. She saw him understand, in real time, that it was working. One of the 3 downstream ranchers, a large man named Aldrich, with the kind of face that made every expression look more severe than it probably was, said, "This creek runs through my south pasture." "I know," Wyatt said. "If Geary controls the access point, he controls what reaches you," Wyatt said. Yes. The room absorbed this. Geary's lawyer began to say something about the specificity of the claim and its application to boundary points, rather than downstream flow, and Aldrich turned and looked at him with the expression of a man who'd just been told something that affected his livelihood and was not interested in a legal qualification of it. Aldous Webb asked if there was additional documentation. Wyatt laid out the survey papers and Clara Fenwick's testimony. He explained who Clara Fenwick was, the witness from the original 1869 signing, still living, whose account put the boundary point 30 feet west of where Geary's claim said it was. He explained that a land attorney from the next county had reviewed both the documentation and the testimony and had provided a written opinion, which Wyatt also placed on the table. The room was quiet in the way rooms were quiet when people were doing actual thinking rather than waiting for their turn to respond. Geary stood. He had the particular quality of a man who had lost the advantage and knew it, and was now operating on the secondary strategy, which was to reframe the terms of the discussion before the primary loss could be consolidated. His voice was measured and his expression was concerned rather than defensive, which was the choice of someone who understood that appearing worried about a situation he'd manufactured was more effective than appearing confident. "I want to be clear," he said, "that my intent in filing the claim was to resolve a legitimate confusion in the county records, not to disadvantage my neighbors." He looked around the room with the manner of a man who had always considered himself a neighbor and was pained to be misunderstood. "If there is documentation that clarifies the correct boundary point, I welcome it. That's all any of us want. Clarity." Several people in the room nodded. She watched them nod and understood what Geary was doing, offering a version of events in which he'd been a reasonable man from the beginning, so that when the claim was ultimately resolved against him, it could be characterized as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate maneuver, and his reputation in the county could remain intact for the next time. She stood up. She had not planned to speak. She had come as a presence and as a resource, the documentation, the notes, the preparation, and she had understood that her speaking would be the most visible thing that happened today, and would carry the most risk. But she watched Geary offer the room a clean exit from accountability, and she thought about the 3 downstream ranchers who hadn't known their water was involved, and she thought about the other operations Geary had worked through over 3 years, and she stood up. The room looked at her. She had expected the specific quality of attention she got, the compounded weight of a room that recognized her, that had opinions about her, that had been given the version of her that Geary's allies had been circulating for 2 weeks. She had expected it and had prepared for what she was going to feel when she felt it, and what she was going to do instead of reacting to it. She addressed Aldous Webb directly. "I work for the Callahan Ranch," she said. "I've been there 6 weeks. In that time I've had occasion to work through the original survey documentation in some detail." She did not pause for the room's opinion of her and did not look to Wyatt for support and did not rush through what she was saying. "What I'd like the room to understand is the pattern of the recording discrepancy, because I think it matters for how this claim is evaluated." She laid out what she'd found. Not the conclusions, the process. The 2 documents, the measurements, where they agreed and where they diverged. Why a discrepancy of this specific kind in a record of this specific age was not the kind of thing that happened by accident in a well-maintained county land office. She'd researched this. She knew what administrative errors in county registrations typically looked like, and this wasn't one of them. The divergence was too clean and it ran in one direction, and it was in the section of the record that pertained to water access and nothing else. She said that plainly. Geary's lawyer said, "This is speculation." "The documentation isn't speculation," she said. "The measurements aren't speculation." Clara Fenwick's signed and witnessed account of what she observed at the original survey in 1869 isn't speculation. She looked at the lawyer directly. What is speculative is the claim that a discrepancy of this nature and specificity is the result of administrative error. I'd want to hear that argument made in more detail before accepting it. The room was very quiet. Webb looked at Geary's lawyer. The lawyer looked at Geary. Geary had an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, not the managed concern from a minute ago. Something more like the expression of a man who had arrived expecting to navigate and had found that the terrain had been changed. What happened next took the better part of 2 hours, because these things always did, and because a room full of ranchers with opinions and a legitimate grievance and enough documentation to demand real answers was not a room that resolved quickly. Aldrich and the two other downstream ranchers asked questions that required actual answers. Two men who had, Eliza gathered from context, had their own difficulties with Geary's acquisition strategy, over the past 3 years began to speak in the circling way of people deciding whether this was the moment to say the thing they'd been holding. One of them said it. His name was Garrett, and he had a small operation north of town that Geary had tried to purchase 18 months ago, and he described the sequence of that attempt with the careful language of a man who had thought a lot about what he could and couldn't prove. The room listened. The second man said that his experience had been similar, not identical, different timing, different approach, but the same underlying structure. Isolation followed by pressure, followed by an offer made when the resistance was lowest. Geary said this was irrelevant to the matter at hand. Webb said the room would decide what was relevant. She sat back down after her initial statement and did not speak again, because she understood that the most important thing she could do in this room was not be the center of it. She'd made the argument that needed making. The room was doing the rest. Wyatt was doing the rest. Aldrich and Garrett and the others were doing the rest. This was what she'd told Wyatt, that the argument couldn't be made by one man alone, that the strength of it came from the number of people it was true for. She watched Harlan Geary across the room and tried to read him. He was managing his expression well, but not perfectly. The not concerned quality was gone, replaced by something more careful and more effortful, the quality of a man doing work that had not been in his plan for today. At the end of the 2 hours, Aldous Webb called for a formal motion to refer the water rights claim to a county land review, with the Callahan documentation submitted as part of the record. The motion passed. Not unanimously. 3 men voted against, and she noted who they were and understood their calculation, but by a margin that was not close. Geary shook Webb's hand with every appearance of graciousness and left with his lawyer and the 2 men he'd arrived with, and the room began to decompress into the smaller conversations that followed any large decision. Wyatt was beside her. "You didn't tell me you were going to speak," he said. "I didn't know I was going to." He looked at her for a moment. "You changed the room." "The documentation changed the room," she said. "I just said what it meant." "Eliza." "It was the work," she said. "It was always the work." He was quiet, and then he said, "Will you stop doing that?" She looked at him. "Stop making yourself smaller than what you did," he said. It came out rougher than he'd probably intended, with the directness of something he'd been sitting on for a while. "I've watched you do it every time someone acknowledges you've done something right. You have it. You give the credit to the documentation or the circumstances or whatever's at hand. I'd like you to stop." She held his eyes for a moment. This was harder than the room full of people had been, in a way she hadn't expected. "All right," she said. He nodded and looked away, and then back. "Margaret wants to have supper at the house tonight, all of us. Reuben, too." "I'll be there," she said. The drive back to the ranch was different from the drive in. Reuben had more to say than he usually did, which was not very much by most standards, but was notable by his. He told Wyatt that Aldrich had pulled him aside after the meeting and said he wanted to talk further about the creek situation. that there might be value in the downstream ranchers documenting their own water usage going back several years, to establish the record before Geary could try a different approach. He's right, Eliza said. Reuben looked at her over his shoulder from the driver's seat. I told him that, he said. I figured you'd agree. Margaret, beside him, said nothing, but the quality of her silence had the texture of someone who was pleased with what she was hearing and had the self-possession not to make a production of it. The ranch was quiet when they returned. Dell and Cass had managed the afternoon without incident, and the cattle were where they were supposed to be, and the North Trough was holding. She did the evening check and found nothing that needed urgent attention, which was its own small satisfaction. She changed into the clean shirt she saved for supper at the house, and walked across the yard and knocked on the door. Margaret opened it. Good, the old woman said, and stood back to let her in. The table in the Callahan house's dining room seated 8, and tonight it had 6, Wyatt at the head, Margaret at the other end, Reuben and Dell on one side, Eliza and Thomas on the other. Cass had been invited and had declined with the cheerful transparency of a 17-year-old who had somewhere else he'd rather be, which Margaret had accepted without comment. The meal was Margaret's cooking, which was straightforward and good in the way of someone who'd been cooking for working people for 50 years and had long since stopped making it complicated. Beef and roasted vegetables and bread still warm from the oven, and a pot of strong coffee. They talked about the meeting. Reuben gave the account of it to Dell, who'd been at the ranch, and in Reuben's telling, Eliza heard for the first time how someone outside her own perspective had read what happened in that room. He described her statement without editorializing it, just what she'd said and how the room had responded, and the plain recounting of it was somehow more substantial than any version she could have given of herself. Dell listened and then looked at her across the table. You told them straight that the error wasn't an error, he said. I said it was worth examining more carefully than an administrative mistake would warrant, she said. You told them straight, Dell repeated, with the tone of someone who wasn't going to let the distinction stand. She let it go. Thomas, beside her, was eating with his usual focused efficiency and not saying much, which was his mode at the house table. But at one point she felt him look at her in the particular way he had when he was organizing something in his mind. She glanced at him. Did you know you were going to win? He asked. The table went slightly quieter. No, she said honestly. I knew the documentation was right. That's not the same as knowing how a room will use it. But you stood up anyway. Yes. Why, if you didn't know it would work. She thought about how to say the things she knew to be true in a way that was useful to a 12-year-old rather than just accurate. Because the alternative was to let Geary tell a version of events that wasn't true, and I knew it wasn't true, and I was the person in the room who'd done the most work to understand why. She paused. You don't always get to know in advance that it'll work. Sometimes you stand up because you're the one who knows, and sitting down would be the wrong use of knowing. Thomas thought about this for a long moment. Okay, he said, and went back to his food. Reuben made a sound that was not quite anything definable but that Eliza had learned, over weeks of paying attention to Reuben, to read as the sound he made when something had been said right. After supper, when the dishes had been cleared and the coffee had gone through its second round, Margaret disappeared into the study and came back with something Eliza didn't immediately recognize, a small framed photograph, the kind made by a traveling daguerreotypist. The image faded to the quality of a memory someone had tried to hold on to. She set it on the table in front of Eliza. A woman. Somewhere in her 30s in the image, with a direct expression and a posture that did not apologize for itself. A working woman, plainly dressed, sitting in front of what appeared to be a homestead structure. My daughter-in-law, Margaret said, Wyatt's mother, taken about 2 years after she arrived from Ohio. Eliza looked at the photograph. She didn't say anything. She also had trouble at first, Margaret said, with this county, with what it decided about her before it knew her. She sat back down and folded her hands in her lap. She was also the most capable person on this ranch within 6 months of arriving. My son knew it. He didn't always know what to do about it. A pause. He figured it out. It was the second time she'd said that, and this time Eliza heard what was underneath it. Not a directive, not pressure, just the offering of a parallel as information. Margaret Callahan had watched one capable woman earn a place in this family through work and stubbornness and the refusal to be smaller than she was. And she was watching it again, and she wanted Eliza to know that she recognized what she was seeing, Wyatt was looking at the photograph, at his mother's face. She would have liked you, he said, to the photograph more than to anyone at the table, and the past tense of it sat in the room quietly, without requiring anyone to respond to it. Reuben pushed back his chair a little and looked at the ceiling in the way he did when he was feeling something he didn't intend to discuss. Dell turned his coffee cup in his hands. Thomas said, "Can I be excused?" And was. Later, walking back to the bunkhouse in the cold, Eliza stopped in the middle of the yard and looked up at the sky, which was clear and very deep and full of the hard winter stars that came out when the temperature dropped far enough to sharpen everything. She stood there longer than she usually allowed herself. She thought about the room today, and Geary's expression when the motion passed, and Clara Fenwick sitting in the study saying he was wrong and she'd come to say so. She thought about Reuben on the driver's bench saying, "I told him you'd agree." She thought about the photograph and the woman in it with the direct expression and the posture that didn't apologize. She thought about what Wyatt had said to her before supper, and the roughness in his voice, and the word smaller. The land dispute was not resolved. The county review would take months, and Geary would not accept the outcome quietly, and there would be more to navigate before this was finished. She knew that clearly and without illusion. But the documentation was in the county record now. Clara Fenwick's testimony was in the county record. 3 downstream ranchers had heard the shape of what Geary had been doing and had put their own voices into the room alongside Wyatt's, and that was not a thing that could be undone by a different approach or a different question. She went inside. She lay down on the bunk that had started to feel in small, imperceptible increments, like hers, and she listened to the wind finding its way through the batting in the window frame. And she thought that in the morning she'd get better batting, something that would actually do the job. And that was a thought she recognized for what it was. The thought of a person who was planning to be somewhere in the morning and the morning after and the ones that followed. She closed her eyes. Outside, the ranch settled into the sounds it made at night. The cattle in the near pasture, the barn boards contracting in the cold, the creak of the bunkhouse under the weight of December coming. And all of it familiar now in the way that things became familiar when you stopped bracing for the moment they would be taken away, and started, carefully and with full knowledge of the risk, letting them become simply the sounds of where you lived. The county land review took 4 months. She had known it would take time, and knowing it didn't make the waiting easier, only more manageable. There was a difference between those two things that she'd had to learn the hard way, the way she'd learned most things, through the experience of confusing them and paying for it. Patience was not the absence of urgency. It was the decision to keep working while the urgent thing resolved itself at whatever pace it was going to resolve at, and not to let the waiting hollow you out. So she worked. December came down hard on Red Hollow County, the kind of winter that reminded people why the frontier had broken so many of the people who'd tried it. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made the air feel solid, and the snow came in the second week of the month and stayed, and the work of keeping a cattle operation alive through that kind of winter was relentless and physical and specific in ways that didn't allow for distraction. She was grateful for that, mostly. The days that were too full to think were the days she didn't lie awake at night running the land dispute through her head, looking for angles she'd missed, preparing arguments for county review proceedings she couldn't control. The new batting in the bunkhouse window frame held against the worst of the cold. A small thing, and not a small thing. She and Reuben had arrived, by December, at a working relationship she would have found difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't watched it develop, because it didn't fit any of the categories that relationships between people in conflict usually resolved into. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't the performed cordiality of people who'd decided to be professionally pleasant. It was something more functional, and in some ways more durable than either. The particular understanding between two people who had sized each other up accurately and found, without exactly liking it, that they respected what they'd found. Reuben knew the ranch better than anyone alive. He had 11 years of accumulated knowledge about which fence sections gave trouble in certain winds, which cattle were prone to respiratory problems in cold weather, which wells ran slow and deep freeze and needed checking first. She had different knowledge, the systematic observation, the documentation habit, the ability to look at a complex problem and find the specific thing that was driving it rather than treating the symptoms. Neither of them could do the other's thing, and they had both, without ever quite saying so, stopped pretending otherwise. He started consulting her. Not asking for opinions. Reuben was not a man who asked for opinions. but presenting situations with the implicit expectation that she would look at them and say what she saw. She did, and he took what was useful and left what wasn't, and they didn't discuss the dynamic because discussing it would have made it self-conscious and therefore worse. Dell noticed. Dell noticed most things, and said very few of them, which was why she trusted his observations when he did offer them. He said one evening in the cookhouse over coffee, 11 years ago Reuben would have quit before he changed his mind about a person. What changed? She asked. He got older, Dell said. Older and tired of being right alone. She thought about that for a long time after. Wyatt was a different matter, and she was honest with herself about the fact that it was a different matter, because pretending otherwise would have been the kind of dishonesty that caused specific damage. Over the months of the winter, she had watched the space between them change in ways that she tracked but didn't act on, because she was not a woman who acted on things she hadn't thought through, and she was very carefully thinking this one through. What she observed, he found reasons to work near where she was working, without manufacturing them. He had started asking her questions at the end of the day about things that were not urgent ranch business, questions that had the quality of a person who was interested in how someone else's mind worked, and had gotten past the point of pretending he wasn't. He had told her once about his father, in the specific detail that meant the telling was intentional rather than incidental. He had stopped being careful around her in the way you were careful around someone you were still evaluating, and had started being careful in a different way, the way you were careful around something that mattered. She noticed all of this. She turned it over and looked at it from multiple angles and tried to be accurate about what she was seeing rather than what she wanted to see, because she had learned the hard way that those two views could produce very different maps. What she found, when she was honest, she was not afraid of it. She was cautious about it, which was different. Fear would have made her smaller. Caution made her more precise. January brought Geary's first counterfiling. It arrived at the ranch by county messenger on a Thursday morning, and Wyatt read it at the kitchen table with the expression of a man encountering something he'd known was coming and still found unpleasant to hold in his hands. He passed it to Eliza without comment. She read it. Then she read it again, because the first read gave her the surface of it, and the second read gave her the structure. He's challenging Clara Fenwick's testimony, she said. On what grounds? Age and memory. He's filed an affidavit from a physician, I don't recognize the name, so he's not local, stating that a person of her age and reported health history cannot be considered a reliable witness to events that occurred over 50 years ago. Wyatt was quiet. This was always a possibility, she said. She said it without softening it, because he needed the accurate version. Her testimony is strong, but it's also the most vulnerable part of our case. He knows that. So what do we do? She set the counterfiling on the table and looked at it. We go see her, she said, and we talk to Hartwell. Hartwell, the vet, whose father had been the other witness at the original survey, had died 8 years ago, as Wyatt had told her back in the fall. But Hartwell herself was still here, and she had grown up in a family that took documentation seriously, which Eliza knew because she had seen it in the way the woman worked and in the organized records she kept in the back of her practice wagon, and also because she had asked on the follow-up visit in November, and Hartwell had said yes. Her father kept records of everything, always. It was a point of pride with him. She had filed that information away. They drove to Clara Fenwick's house on Friday. The old woman received them in her sitting room with the unhurried composure of someone who had been expecting this and had already decided how she felt about it. Her granddaughter, the same one who'd driven her to the ranch in the fall, sat in the corner and said nothing. Clara read Geary's counterfiling with the careful attention of a person who understood exactly what she was reading. She set it on her knee when she was done. He's calling me senile, she said. He's questioning the reliability of your recollection, Eliza said. He's framed it as a medical concern. I am 81 years old and I remember that survey as well as I remember my wedding day, Clara said. Better, possibly. My wedding had a great deal going on. The survey was specific and important and I was paying attention. We know that, Eliza said. The question is how we document it for the county review. What do you need? We need your account of the survey in as much physical detail as you can provide. Specific details, the time of day, the weather, where each person stood, what instruments the surveyor used, what was said. Details that a person reconstructing a general memory couldn't produce, but that a person with a real memory of a real event could. Clara looked at her steadily. That's a precise request. It's a precise problem, Eliza said. The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, It was late September. We started in the morning after the dew was off the grass. The surveyor's name was Caldwell. I don't remember his given name. And he had an assistant, a young man with red hair who wouldn't stop talking. The markers were iron stakes, not wooden. My husband brought a packed lunch because we were out most of the day. It rained briefly around midday, and we stopped, and the surveyor put his papers inside his coat to keep them dry. She paused. At the water access point, there was a discussion about the creek fork because the spring flooding had shifted the bank somewhat, and Caldwell was very specific about which fork he meant and measured from which reference point. My husband asked him twice to confirm it. He confirmed it both times. Eliza was writing as fast as she could. You remember which fork, she said. The western branch narrows before it bends south, Clara said. The measurement was taken from the narrowing point, not the bend. Caldwell was clear about that because my husband asked specifically. She looked at Eliza. I imagine that matters. It matters considerably, Eliza said. They had 3 things by the end of January. Clara's expanded testimony with the physical detail that made a challenge on grounds of general memory failure much harder to sustain. A letter from Hartwell with copies of her father's field notes from the same survey, which he had attended in a supporting capacity and which contained his own notation of the Western Branch narrowing point as the reference. And a second opinion from the land attorney in the next county who had reviewed Geary's physician's affidavit and noted in writing that it did not meet the standard of evidence required to invalidate a first-person witness account in a county land review. She assembled all of it, made 3 copies, and delivered 1 set to the county land office herself. The clerk at the county land office, a young man who had the nervous energy of someone not entirely comfortable with the weight of what passed through his office, received the documentation with the careful neutrality of someone trying very hard not to have opinions about what he was handling. He recorded it, stamped it, gave her a receipt. She walked out into the February cold and stood on the steps of the county building for a moment, and she thought, this is the work. Not the dramatic moment, not the confrontation in the community hall, not the thing people would remember and talk about. This, the documentation assembled, the copies made, the receipt in her pocket, the thing done right so that it would hold. She walked back to the wagon where Wyatt was waiting, and she gave him the receipt, and he looked at it and put it in his coat pocket, and they drove back to the ranch, and there was work waiting that had nothing to do with land disputes, a cow with early signs of the same respiratory problem that had affected the steers in November, a section of fence that had come down under the snow load. And they did that work, and the afternoon passed, and supper came. That was February. The county review hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of March, and March in Red Hollow County came in with the particular cruelty of a winter that knew it was losing but intended to make the losing felt. The temperature swung, mild enough on some days to suggest spring and then plunging back to hard frost overnight. And the mud was the specific kind that made every physical task take twice as long and required twice the stubbornness to do anyway. She drove to the county seat with Wyatt and Reuben on the morning of the hearing. The county seat was 12 miles east, a larger town than Red Hollow, with a proper courthouse that had a 2nd floor and glass windows on all sides. She had been in courthouses before, in other counties, for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with people who had things she didn't, and the legal machinery that protected those things, and she'd learned how to be in them, how to read a room that ran on procedure rather than character, how to present information in the register that the room could use. Geary was there with his lawyer and 2 other men, one of whom she recognized from the community hall, and one she didn't. He acknowledged Wyatt with the minimal courtesy that had become his established register for these encounters, and he looked at Eliza the way he always looked at her, as though she were a complicating factor he was still in the process of accounting for. The review was conducted by a county land commissioner named Hargrove, a spare, precise woman in her 60s who had the quality Eliza most respected in people handling authority. She appeared to find the work itself interesting rather than the power of it. She had read the submissions in advance. That was clear from the way she moved through the documentation without having to locate anything, referencing specific pages with the confidence of someone who knew where they were. She heard both sides. Geary's lawyer made the case that the county registration represented the official and binding record, and that challenges to it required a higher standard of proof than a disputed personal account and privately held documents. He was skilled, and he was not wrong that this was a real legal standard. The question was whether the documentation met it. Wyatt presented the case plainly, the way he did everything. He let the documents speak as much as possible and added only what the documents needed to be understood. Hargrove asked questions. Her questions were good, specific, probing the parts of the case that were genuinely uncertain rather than performing thoroughness. She asked Wyatt about the chain of custody of the witnessed copy. She asked about Clara Fenwick's availability to testify in person if required. She asked about Hartwell's father's field notes and the basis for identifying them as contemporaneous rather than later records. Eliza answered the last question because Wyatt deferred to her on it, and she answered it in the same register she'd used at the community hall. Specifically, without elaboration, with the documentation itself doing as much of the work as possible. Hargrove listened, looked at the notes in question, looked at Eliza, and made her own notation. It took 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, Hargrove said she would need 2 weeks to complete her review and issue a ruling, and that both parties would be notified by county mail. 2 weeks. Eliza had been waiting for months. 2 weeks was nothing, and it was the longest 14 days she'd sat through since she'd arrived in Red Hollow. She put her attention back on the ranch and kept it there. Spring was coming whether the county issued a ruling or not, and spring on a cattle operation was its own kind of urgency. The grazing rotation she'd flagged in the fall needed to be managed carefully. Coming out of winter, the south pasture required attention before it was grazed. 2 of the older fence runs needed replacing before the ground softened enough to reset posts. She made lists. She worked the lists. Thomas helped her with the south pasture assessment, walking the ground with the focused attention she'd been watching him develop all winter. He was 13 in March. His birthday had been in January, quiet and noted by Margaret with a cake and a new pair of work gloves. And the 3 months since the fall had done something to him that she could see but couldn't have named precisely. He'd grown, obviously, the particular fast growth of a boy that age, but it was something else too. He'd gotten more deliberate, more sure of his own observations. The east section came through better than I thought, he said, crouching to look at the grassroot structure. The snow cover protected it, she said. We got lucky with the timing. Is it luck if you plan for it? She looked at him. You adjusted the rotation in the fall, he said. You knew this section needed rest. So when the snow came and covered it at the right time, that wasn't luck. That was the plan working. The snow timing was luck, she said. The rest was planning. They both mattered. He thought about this. How do you know which is which? You mostly know after, she said, which is why you don't take credit for the luck, and you don't blame yourself for the weather. He absorbed this with the seriousness he brought to everything she said, which she had learned to be careful about, because he had the quality of a person who kept what he found useful and built it into how he operated, and she was aware that she was teaching him things she hadn't entirely intended to teach. She didn't think that was a bad thing. She thought it was a responsibility, which was different. The ruling arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of March. She was in the barn when Wyatt came in with the county envelope in his hand. She could tell from the way he was holding it, the particular stillness of someone who hadn't opened it yet, and was giving himself one more moment before it became a known thing rather than a possible one. She waited. He opened it. She watched him read. His face was the face he wore when he was working, attentive and contained, the expression that processed things internally rather than displaying them. She had learned to read it in the months since the fall, but this required a different kind of reading. She watched his eyes move through the document, and she watched the quality of his stillness change. He looked up. We won, he said. She let out a breath she hadn't been aware she'd been holding. The ruling was what the documentation had made it. Hargrove had found the witness copy, and Clara Fenwick's testimony sufficient to establish that the county registration contained a recording error, and she had ordered the record corrected to reflect the Western Branch narrowing point as the survey reference. Geary's claim was dismissed. The water access belonged to the Callahan Ranch by the corrected boundary, which was where it had always belonged. Geary had 30 days to appeal. He'll appeal, she said. Probably, Wyatt said. His lawyer will tell him the appeal doesn't have a strong foundation given what Hargrove put in the ruling. His lawyer will tell him that, Wyatt agreed. Whether he listens is a different thing. He didn't appeal. She found out later, through the particular network of county information that operated through the feed store and the livery and the post office and Margaret's correspondence, that Geary's lawyer had spent the 30 days telling him the same thing the ruling's language had already said, and that Geary had, in the end, done the calculation that the appeal would cost more than it could win. It was not a moment of conscience. It was arithmetic. But the arithmetic came out the same way the right thing would have, and sometimes that was what you got instead of justice, and you took it. The news moved through the county in the way that news moved in counties. Not officially, not all at once, but in the spreading manner of water finding its level. Aldrich sent a note by his farmhand. Garrett showed up in person, which she gathered was unusual for Garrett, and sat at the cookhouse table and drank coffee and told Wyatt he'd started documenting his own water usage and intended to keep doing it. Good idea, Wyatt said. Wasn't mine, Garrett said, looking at Eliza. It was good regardless of whose it was, she said. Garrett looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man still adjusting to what he was looking at, the way people sometimes did when the version of a thing they'd built in their head had to be revised against the actual thing in front of them. Then he nodded and went back to his coffee, and that was that. Clara Fenwick received the ruling by county mail, and, according to her granddaughter, who told Margaret, who told Eliza, read it at her kitchen table and said, "Of course," and went back to what she was doing. She was 81 years old. She had not doubted the outcome, or if she had, she'd kept the doubt to herself, which was itself a kind of courage. Eliza went to see her a week after the ruling. Clara received her alone this time. The granddaughter was not in the house, and poured tea with the unhurried efficiency of a person who had been making tea for 60 years and found the ritual neither troublesome nor sentimental. She set the cups on the table and sat down. "It's done," Eliza said. "Yes," Clara said. "I wanted to thank you. What you did. Coming to us in the fall, the testimony, the expanded account. Without it, the documentation couldn't have carried the weight." Clara looked at her with an expression that was not quite amusement but carried some of its elements. "You're thanking me for telling the truth about what I saw," she said. "I'm thanking you for trusting that the truth mattered enough to say it to a room full of people who might have decided not to believe it." The old woman was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea and then at the window and then back at Eliza. "I had a situation," she said, "about 30 years ago. A different kind of situation. Someone used the same type of argument against me, that my account of something I'd witnessed couldn't be trusted because of who I was. My age, then, my sex, mostly." She paused. "No one documented it. No one assembled the evidence. It cost me something I couldn't get back." She looked at Eliza directly. "I wasn't going to let that happen again, not if I could do something to stop it." Eliza held that. "What was taken from you?" she said carefully. Was it ever—" "No," Clara said, simply and without self-pity. "Some things don't come back. You learn to know the difference between the things that can be made right and the things you just have to carry. The important thing is knowing which is which." She went back to the ranch and she carried that with her, not as a weight, but as something that sat alongside everything else she was carrying, companionable in the way that true things were. Spring arrived properly in April, with the genuine warmth that replaced the false warmth of March, and didn't take it back overnight. The ground dried and the grass came in, and the south pasture, rested through the winter by the rotation she'd adjusted in October, came up better than the previous year. She and Thomas walked it on a Tuesday morning, and she watched him look at it with the expression of a person seeing the result of a plan, the connection between the fall decision and the spring outcome. "The plan worked," he said. "This part of the plan," she said. "Ask me again in July." He smiled at that. Not the quick smile of politeness, but the real one. The one that was still rare enough to be worth noticing. He was growing into something, she thought. Some version of himself that was specifically his. She had tried, over the months, to teach him things that were useful. Animal care, observation, the habit of documentation. But what she hadn't been able to give him, and knew she couldn't give him, was the thing he was finding on his own. A way of being present in the world that was his rather than anyone else's. She thought that was enough. She thought that was actually quite a lot. The conversation with Wyatt happened on an evening in late April, when the light lasted long enough after supper that you could sit outside in it and feel that the day hadn't entirely closed. She was at the workbench outside the barn. She'd moved it outside when the weather turned, preferring the open air to the dimness. and he came and sat on the fence rail nearby, which was a thing he'd started doing in February and had continued without comment. They sat for a while in the way they'd learned to sit together without the silence requiring management. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking through the language for something that mattered. "When you arrived," he said, "you were on your way out of the county. You'd have kept going." "Yes." "What made you stop at the gate?" She thought about the bay gelding with its hoof down and its head up after the stone came free. The small thing that was not a small thing. "The horse needed help," she said. "That's all?" That was enough. She looked at the bench she was working on, and then at him. "I've spent most of my life making calculations about where to put my energy. It wasn't a calculation. It was just, the horse needed help and I could help, and stopping seemed right." He nodded slowly. "I hired you because the horse was standing square on all 4 feet," he said. "That's the truth of it. I'd been watching that horse all day not knowing what to do about it, and you fixed it in 10 minutes, and I thought I had been making the same mistake everyone else makes, looking at what something appears to be instead of what it can do." "It was a stone and a hoof," she said. "It wasn't complicated." "You stopping was complicated," he said. "You didn't have to. After the day you'd had. After every town before that." He looked at her with the direct attention he brought to the things that mattered to him. "I want you to know that I know that stopping cost you something and you did it anyway." She held his eyes for a moment and let the statement land rather than deflecting it, which was something she was still learning to do. Let the things that were true just be true without having them. "I want to ask you something else," he said. "Go ahead." "Are you planning to stay?" She looked at the bench she was working on, the field beyond it, the horses at the far fence in the evening light, the north trough, holding, the south pasture, coming in. Maisie in the back pen, fully healed, Maisie's calf born in February and healthy. Thomas in the barn, doing the evening check with the thoroughness she'd taught him and the judgment he'd found himself. Margaret in the house, her photograph of Wyatt's mother back on the shelf in the study, where Eliza had put it herself after they'd been through the survey box. Reuben's bread passed down the table. She thought about Red Hollow and the Cattleman's Exchange and the 4 towns before it and the particular arithmetic of her coin tin that never came out right. She thought about what belonging meant, not the idea of it, which she'd spent years pursuing like a thing she could find if she just got to the right place, but the actual substance of it, which it turned out was nothing like she'd imagined. It was not a rival. It was not a moment. It was more like what she'd told Thomas about planning versus luck. You mostly knew it after, in the accumulated weight of ordinary days that had become yours without you quite noticing the transition. She had not noticed the exact moment she'd stopped bracing for this to be taken away. That was how she knew it had happened. "Yes," she said, "I'm planning to stay." He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the field the way she'd been looking at it, with the same accumulated knowledge of a person who had counted those fence posts enough times that they were not just fence posts but a specific number of specific things that he was responsible for and had chosen to be responsible for. "Good," he said. There was more between them than that word, and they both knew it, and neither of them was in a hurry, because the thing between them had been building with the patience of something that intended to last, and rushing it would have been the wrong kind of impatience for 2 people who had both learned, through entirely different roads, that the things worth having were the things you didn't grab at. They sat in the evening light until it thinned and cooled, and the horses moved away from the far fence, and the first sounds of the night came up from the pasture, and then they went in, separately, and the ranch did what it did at the end of every day, which was settle into itself and rest and wait for morning. But that was not where the story settled. The story settled somewhere both smaller and larger than a single evening. It settled in the June morning when she and Thomas were replacing the corner post on the south fence, the one Reuben had told her about in her first week, the worst section, the one Wyatt kept meaning to replace. And Reuben came out to check the work and stayed to do the heavy end of it without being asked, the 3 of them working in the easy silence of people who knew each other's habits. And when they set the post and tamped the earth around it, Thomas said, "That's not going anywhere," with a satisfaction that was not about the post at all, and everyone understood that and no one said so. It settled in the July afternoon when Hartwell came for her quarterly check and sat at the cookhouse table afterward and told Eliza she'd been telling people in the county about the work on Maisie's foot, about what had been caught and treated before it became permanent damage, and that 2 ranchers had come to her in the spring with animals they might not have brought in previously because someone had shown them it was worth looking carefully at things before they got worse. "You started something," Hartwell said, "without intending to." "Most of the things worth starting happen that way," Eliza said. It settled in the letter from Deacon Price, the man from the Cattlemen's Exchange, the one who had looked at her in the doorway and made his decision in the first second and hadn't thought anything more of it, that arrived at the ranch in August, addressed to Wyatt, and contained a request for Eliza's consultation on a cattle health problem at his operation. She read the letter twice because the first reading seemed improbable. Then she wrote back that she'd come on Thursday, and she went on Thursday, and she did the work, and Deacon Price watched her do it without the expression he'd worn in the doorway of his exchange, and at the end he said thank you in the tone of someone who was saying something they hadn't expected to have occasion to say. She said you're welcome and drove back to the ranch and didn't perform anything about it, and didn't diminish it either. It settled, most of all, in something she couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have known to want, the feeling of waking up on a morning in October, exactly 1 year after she'd come through the gate with her wagon and a grinding wheel bearing and her coin tin, and lying in the room that was hers, listening to the sounds she knew, and feeling not the relief of a person who'd survived something, but the quieter and more sustainable thing underneath it. The thing that didn't require a name, that was not happiness in the performed sense. That was just the straightforward weight of a life that was hers, and that she'd chosen, and that was choosing her back. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known a year ago. Not the things she'd learned about cattle or water rights or fence splices in high wind. Those mattered, but they were not what she meant. She meant the other things. The things you couldn't put in a ledger. She had learned that belonging was not a destination. She had spent years treating it like a place she needed to reach, somewhere beyond the next county line, through the right door, with the right person willing to see her correctly. What it actually was, she understood now, was a practice. A daily accumulation of small choices, to stay when leaving would have been easier, to keep working when the work wasn't being acknowledged, to tell the truth about what she saw even when the room hadn't asked her to. Belonging was something you built, not something you found, and you built it out of exactly the ordinary materials that every day put in front of you. She had learned that being seen clearly by even one person was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the thing. Wyatt had looked at her and seen what she could do rather than what she appeared to be, and that single act of accurate seeing had been the hinge on which everything else had turned. She had thought for years that she needed people to see her differently. All of them, everyone, the whole county, the whole world. She had been wrong about the quantity. One person who looked honestly was worth 100 who looked without seeing, and you found that person not by making yourself easier to see, but by being where you were, working at what you knew, until the right eyes turned in your direction. She had learned that the people who changed things were not usually the people who arrived with that intention. She had not come to Red Hollow to change anything. She had come to find work and keep going. What had changed because she did the work in front of her, and the work turned out to matter to more people than she'd known she was working for. She had learned that the cruelty of people who judged without knowing said more about the exhausting loneliness of that kind of certainty than it said about the person being judged. Deacon Price, in the doorway of this Cattlemen's Exchange, with his quick comprehensive scan and his instant verdict, had not been powerful. He had been afraid of something he didn't understand, and afraid people would see he didn't understand it, and the quickest way to manage that fear had been to dismiss what confused him before it could ask anything of him. She didn't forgive that. She didn't need to. She just understood it clearly enough that it had stopped having the same authority over her that it once did. She had learned most painfully and most usefully that the voice inside her that said leaving was kinder, that her presence cost people more than it gave, that she should make herself smaller and quieter and less in order to be acceptable. That voice was not wisdom. It had felt like wisdom because it had the shape of self-sacrifice and the sound of consideration for others. But it was fear wearing wisdom's clothes, and the difference between them was that wisdom made you more present in your own life, while fear, dressed up as consideration, made you absent from it. She had stayed. That was the thing, Through Geary and Reuben and the talk in town and the months of waiting and the 2 weeks silence after the county review was submitted, she had stayed. And what she had found on the other side of staying was not triumph and was not vindication and was not the moment where everyone who had been wrong admitted they had been wrong. It was something more mundane and more sustaining, the North Trough holding, and Thomas walking the south pasture in June, and Reuben passing the bread, and the bay gelding standing square on 4 good feet the morning after the stone came free, just standing there, recovered and ordinary and fine. She got up on that October morning, the 1-year morning, and she dressed, and she went to the barn, and she did the morning check in the order she had established, moving through the stalls the way she always moved through them, with the accumulated knowledge of a person who knew each animal by its particular habits and history, who knew which ones needed watching and which were fine and which were in the specific middle state of fine but worth checking. And the barn was warm with animal heat and smelled the way barns smelled. And the light came in through the gaps in the boards the way it always did, and everything was exactly what it was. She heard boots on the ground outside. His circuit. Barn, north fence, cookhouse. She knew the sound of it. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her, which was what he always did. Stopped for just a moment, the same pause every morning, as if he was still slightly surprised and had decided to keep being surprised rather than get used to it. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He started his check and she finished hers, and they worked in the easy quiet of people who had done this enough times that the silence between them had become its own kind of conversation, full of the things that didn't need to be said because they were already known. Outside, the October morning was doing what October mornings did, cold and clear, and carrying the smell of the season turning, the particular smell that was neither summer nor winter, but the intelligent pause between them, the moment when the year took stock of itself before committing to what came next. The cattle were where they were supposed to be. The trough was full. The south pasture had rested and recovered and would rest again. Thomas would be up in an hour. Margaret would have the coffee on. Reuben would come across the yard with the particular deliberate pace that was just his walk, not hurry and not reluctance, just a man moving toward the day's work because that was what the day required. None of it was exceptional. That was the point. None of it was exceptional, and all of it was hers. And those two facts taken together were the whole of what she had been looking for. Not the dramatic version, not the story she might have told herself as a girl, about the moment everything changed and the world opened up, and the people who'd been wrong admitted it in a room with everyone watching. The real version was this, the barn in the morning, the work that waited, the man who stopped in the doorway, the life that was ordinary because it was actually, finally, hers.